Here's how one hidden problem cost my project $90,000 on a $1 mistake. And here's a simple fix I wish I knew sooner to keep this from happening. This is a letter to myself 10 years ago. Welcome to the Lighthouse Leadership Podcast. I'm Evan Hickok. I've got over 20 years experience designing and managing high complexity systems in high consequence environments. I've done this as a systems engineer and as a program manager, guiding projects through every phase of the product lifecycle. And I'm here to share my insights on building high performance teams capable of delivering exceptional results, even in the most challenging environments. Go back to 2014. I was traveling to a different location, a 3-hour drive, every week for 7 months, where I struggled to turn around a failing program. In fact, I did not turn it around. I didn't recognize that I didn't understand the 4 fundamentals of building a team. At the time, I had led several teams, but I'd never kicked one off. I had basically inherited teams someone else kicked off, and I succeeded by not messing them up. I had been the best engineer I could be on those teams. I excelled through technical expertise. I made good, high-level technical decisions for a team that was already high-performing. I didn't know that being on a high-performing team and building a high-performing team are about as different as living in a house and building one. I'd never been asked to lead a struggling team. I'd never been asked to turn one around. So I defaulted what always worked, which was being the smartest person in the room. But that wasn't enough. The issues went deeper than engineering challenges. The team lacked a shared goal. Communication was broken. Problems went untracked. I didn't impose my leadership strongly enough because I didn't know where to start when I didn't know every detail. There were so many issues, and leading them to closure was different than anything I had ever encountered. I know how to handle it now. One of those issues was this plastic bearing. It was a seemingly small problem, but it revealed everything that was broken about the way this team worked. Here's a little case study in leadership failure. The thing we were working on was this mechanical control system, and one of the key components in our system was this plastic bearing. It was about the size of a coffee mug. And driven by our control motor, the position of this bearing inside of this tight-fitting metal housing was the basic thing the system was controlling. The bearing was made of this exotic self-lubricating plastic. It's called Delrin. It was a pretty elegant solution, except for one flaw. Our tolerances were so tight. So this called for a Delrin with a precise heat treatment to help it maintain its shape. But if scratched, the untreated layers underneath could absorb moisture, they'd swell, and they'd ultimately bind. And if bound up, the unit required total disassembly, which was impossible in the field. Spoiler alert, that happened. This issue should have been a top priority. Instead, it was dismissed. Now, when I first heard about the issue, I explored it. I was told the risk of scratching would be, quote, managed by process. They would create a special assembly instruction to ensure the bearing was handled with care during assembly. But no one actually ever created that process. This location's culture that I was visiting, it was like they had a startup mindset. And what I mean by that is they were very process light. And in this case, they were charged with creating a production-worthy design, which is completely counter their culture. They were way out of their element. And so was I. I found this hard to believe. There was another product that had been returned by a customer for a missing feature that was described in the advertisement. And they responded, "Oh, we didn't know you wanted that." It's in their advertisement. Amazing. In hindsight, I failed to push hard enough on this issue. I didn't feel confident challenging these senior engineers who are so much technically smarter on this topic than I was. The thing was, they didn't need another engineer. What they needed was a leader that could take the average intelligence of these people and turn it into a collective intelligence. Now, on this bearing issue, I should have insisted on finding alternatives and on documenting a clear risk mitigation strategy, and on tracking the issue properly. Instead, we moved forward as if the problem had been solved, only for it to resurface when the same failure repeated itself in future builds. So what could I have done differently? It's easy. Make the problem visible. I should have created a clear visual tracking system that forced us to confront our unresolved risks. But at the time, we didn't even have a way to track our to-dos, let alone prioritize them. Now, I call this a system without memory. This is one of the core issues they had. The team wasn't tracking anything. There was no backlog. There was no issue tracking system. No way to ensure that problems once encountered were recorded, prioritized, and resolved. I remember my first drive to this plant. It was October. It was a beautiful drive to an eastern New England state. I'd been on the same project for 6 years previously, and I felt excited to jump into a new project and to learn some new tech. I walked into the facility. I found the project manager, the only name I had been given. He's standing up. He just spilled a cup of coffee on a very messy desk. I said, hello, Bob. I'm Evan. I've been sent here to help. Where should we start? He said, I don't understand why you're here. We've got this. I said, okay. Well, I've heard you haven't run this project review in about 3 months. I could take that off your plate. What are your 3 most difficult problems? So he gave me a list of issues. I cobbled together a meeting, conducted it, and I presented these 3 issues, and I got some advice and some resources. They told me like, oh, we've seen a similar problem. Go talk to so-and-so. Oh, here's some funding that maybe could do this sort of thing. I'm like, gosh, I returned back to the project manager, said, hey, Bob, I've got a commitment for resources on these 3 issues. Let's talk about those. He said, oh, we've just finished those. You mean you just finished the 3 hardest problems that you handed me? Okay. I wasn't asking for your morning to do. What's actually hard? What are you using to track your issues? He's like scathing, looks at me and points to his head. He tracks his issues in his head. For a several $1 million development program, a team of like 13, 14, 15 people, something like that. This reared its ugly head just a couple months later. This issue cost us $90,000 on a $1 part. Let me break it down. There were 3 separate failures and 1 invisible problem. I'm standing looking over the shoulder of a software engineer at the graphical user interface, the GUI. There was a camera display with several numbers and an overlay from the sensors. A little bit like your phone. There's in each of the corners is one with like temperature, one with GPS position, that sort of thing. There's a number in one corner that I couldn't quite figure out. It said 24.3 INHG. Like, I don't know what that is. So I said to the software engineer, what's that number on the GUI there? I said, oh, that's the pressure reading. Pressure. Okay. I can tell you atmospheric pressure is 14.7 PSI, but I couldn't think of a unit that converted to 24. So what are the units? It said inches of mercury. It says right there. I said, oh, right. Now, how do you know it's right? Do you have a calibrated standard somewhere? He said, no. So I checked the weather app, pulled out my phone, checked the weather app, and weather.com told me the local pressure was closer to 27 inches of mercury. That's about 10% higher than the GUI was reporting. I told him, I said, weather.com tells me the local pressure is about 27 inches of mercury. Do you know why this might be reporting 10% lower? He said, it's always been low. Okay. So I went over to our system simulator. It's a computer with a control algorithm in it. And I gave it 2 pressure readings, 24 inches of mercury and 27 inches of mercury. The difference the algorithm output was way outside our program accuracy requirement. Like if we really had this difference in actual pressure and recorded pressure, our entire system wasn't going to work because it was outside of the bounds of the requirements. The single issue would prevent the entire thing from working correctly. So I went back to the software engineer and I said, when you said this has always been low, have you told anybody about this? I said, yeah, I told my boss. Oh, well, when did you tell him? How about 2 years ago? 2 years ago. Okay. And what happened? I don't know. I never heard back. For 2 years, a critical system issue existed and no one had done anything about it. The issue never got written down, which means it never got prioritized, which means it never got solved. It lived inside someone's head for 2 years. When we finally investigated it, we discovered 3 separate failures. 1, the pressure sensor selected wasn't precise enough to maintain the system's required accuracy. I learned later it was always intended to be a placeholder sensor, not final. More untracked technical debt. 2, the sensor wasn't being powered correctly. This is a board-mounted pressure sensor, an integrated chip, less than half the size of my pinky nail. Cost about $1. The power it was receiving through the circuit card assembly wasn't even correct. And so that reduced its already insufficient accuracy or precision. 3, the wrong calibration values were being used in the software. 3 issues: a circuit selection issue, its integration of the hardware, and its integration of the software. Any one of these failures alone would have thrown off our system's accuracy. Together, they made the system completely unusable. And because no one had ever documented the issue, nobody had ever prioritized it, we rediscovered it right after we had already spent $90,000 in 4 weeks on what was supposed to be the final respin of the circuit board stack. And so fixing this issue required another expensive redesign, one that could have been avoided entirely if they had simply tracked the problem properly. Now, there were several straws that broke the camel's back in this project. I don't actually remember which one was finally fatal, but this one was definitely up there. None of them were documented the day I arrived. 0. Remember that? I asked the project manager for his top 3 problems. He gave me his morning to-do list. So what would I do differently? The failures in that program weren't just technical. They were leadership failures, which included mine. So if I can go back to 2014, I would ensure everyone understood the system's purpose and the purpose of each constituent subsystem. That's called alignment. 2, I would have implemented a robust visual issue tracking system. I call this a transparent process. Problems can't be prioritized and solved if they aren't documented. You can't prioritize stuff in your head. You got to get it out. As David Allen says, the mind is for having ideas, not for holding them. Write your stuff down. Make it visual. Now, I say robust here, right? I only had the resources to kludge together a SharePoint issue tracker. When I arrived, there were 0 recorded issues. By the time I left, there were 285 recorded issues, and some of those were really hard. If a problem isn't visible, it doesn't exist. Now, if this were today, I'd have used Jira or Monday or Notion or Motion. There's so many tools out there now. There were plenty of tools in 2014 too, but there's so many tools right now. Pick one and go. 3, I would have pushed harder on accountability. When people said they'll manage this Delrin risk by process, I should have demanded to see that process written down. Remember the difference between leadership and management. Leadership is saying, this is the work. Management is executing that work. I would have been a better manager. I would have followed up relentlessly until I saw proof of this procedure executed. 3, I would trust leadership more than technical intelligence. I had spent years succeeding by being the smartest person in the room I was in. And now I found myself in a room where everybody knew more about the system than I did. I thought I had to catch up to them and be smarter than them to get the things to happen. But that's not what it is. Leadership is not about having the right answers. It's about creating a system and an environment where problems are surfaced, prioritized, and solved. I should have focused less on solving problems myself and more on ensuring the team had a framework to solve them collectively. So to conclude, write it down. Lead with clarity. I didn't start writing until years later. I now realize that if I had begun in 2014, I would have figured out leadership faster. Here's the thing. Writing forces clarity. Writing forces reflection. It forces structure. Leadership requires the same things. Okay, that wraps today's episode. Here's a quick summary of what we covered. First, hidden problems quietly drain resources, like the seemingly minor $1 mistake that cost $90,000 due to poor issue tracking. 2, effective leadership isn't about having all the answers yourself. It's about creating systems that surface and prioritize and resolve those issues in a transparent way. Create that environment. Last, the simple yet most powerful tool you have is to write things down. Write down your day. Write down 3 things that went well. Write down 3 things you wish worked differently. These will help you find the patterns. And one of those patterns will always be documenting issues, prevents hidden problems from resurfacing, and it ensures accountability. All right, ready to elevate your leadership? Head over to evanhickok.com. Sign up for my newsletter where I give actionable frameworks and stories like this one weekly. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, great leaders don't just react, they anticipate. I'm Evan Hickok. See you next time. Ciao.